The fifth common cause of foodborne illness is adulterated food. Americans rarely think about this risk factor since we live in a country where we have strict regulations. However, it's important to know what to look for in an adulterated food. First of all, though you may love your grandma's jellies and meatloaf, you can't use home canned or prepared food in a restaurant setting. Meat must be USDA inspected, including game meat. Milk must be grade A. Eggs must be from a regulated source. All food that is served or sold to the public must come from a source regulated by an agency like the FDA, USDA, or the local health department. Here are some examples of foods that would not meet the standards required to be served to the public. If there is a dent or crease on any seam, the can should be rejected. If a regular can opener cannot open the can, then it should be rejected. If the can cannot stand upright, or if it's bulging, then the can should be rejected. Finally, if there's any cut on the end seam, reject the can as well. At receiving, the person in charge should look at the labels for proper hot and cold holding temperatures and expiration dates, but also keep an eye out for spoilage and insect or rodent infestation. It's so important for the person in charge to be available when deliveries come through the door to ensure the food order is safe and of exceptional quality. You are the customer, and you should get what you order. Good retail practices are things that are not necessarily going to prevent an illness outbreak, but they are rules that should still be followed on a daily basis. Storage areas should be clean and dry, and all food must be stored at least 6 inches off the floor and away from the walls. Follow the first in, first out principle. Use foods with the most recent expiration date last. Date mark potentially hazardous foods properly. These are foods that are prepared on site or have been opened. These foods must contain the date it was prepared or opened and/or the day it will be discarded. Potentially hazardous foods cannot be stored more than 7 days. Disease vectors are those insects, rodents, and other animals that transmit disease-causing organisms to the skin, food, or other objects. It's very important to control these pests before they become a problem. The best way to do this is to clean and sanitize regularly, deny them food, and deny them access. Do not, under any circumstances, leave doors to your establishment wide open. This is an open invitation for vectors to invade your kitchen. Other risk factors involve chemical storage, structural design, and lighting. Keep all chemicals away from food storage. Label everything, even water. Many times it's difficult to tell the difference between flour and rat poison or water and bleach water. Always follow label recommendations. The manufacturers develop the chemicals and know exactly how they should be used. Please do not take it upon yourself to mix up your own concoction. Structurally, everything in the establishment should be built using easy-to-clean, non-porous surfaces. There should be adequate lighting throughout the food preparation and storage areas. Okay, it's time to review the things we've learned.
There's lots of resources out there. And the resources can come from inside the company, from each other, or it can come from the university itself because they do have a culinary program. It can also come from the schools and specifically a website that has an administrator's manual. So in our school operations, that administrator's manual has a lot of good information and good references that are available. The last slide that we have up here, let's see, we've got one to Roscoe, and that has to do with something called, what's wrong with this picture? And this is an easy one, Roscoe. I didn't know what level of knowledge you had, so you know, I made it real easy for you. I got Jimmy Chen over here that's prepared a great meal at home, and he's bringing it in for us to serve in the restaurant, and he wants us to serve. So what's wrong with this?
Well, A, we can't serve it because I mean, there's so many levels of contamination there. The vehicle that you're cooking at home, got one of those because got a cat walking around. Handmade pickles might be delicious, but they're done at home. We can't control those. Those jars have got cloth lids on them, which can easily blow off and contaminate. And
that's applesauce. That's Mama's applesauce.
I don't care. They look like they're sealed right.
All right. Well, what we've got is the fact that it goes back to food sourcing. We have to be aware that the food that we get, it comes from a good source that's approved. Home foods are not a good source. Okay? That can be birthday cakes, it can be anything, but we can't serve it. Yes, sir.
Does that include fresh herbs from your garden at home? Like fresh basil, fresh thyme, fresh herbs from your own personal herb garden?
It goes back to sourcing, okay? And that's an area that is touchy. Here's why. What kind of fertilizer have you used? Where is it being grown? And the only operation that I can think of that had that was one of our operations that had a compost post and a herb garden right next to each other. And the cooks would go out and pick fresh mint and fresh basil and fresh this and fresh that. Now, another side of the coin is the fact that if I'm a professional and I've got an herb garden and I bring that particular stuff into a kitchen and I wash it well and I do everything I'm supposed to and I put the ingredients in, it's still not an approved source for an institutional or commercial kitchen. For a private operation, it might be fine. So the level of risk doesn't warrant us using that type of thing. Buy it from an approved source. Okay. Next slide. Amy, next question. Real simple. What's your first thoughts on each one of these photos? It's a thermocoupler. It's hot and cold. It's more accurate because of the type of thermometer and the type of calibration that can occur. It's one that can go inside an oven. Okay? Has a wider range of temperatures most often. How about that one? That's a simple one. Digital STEM. Okay? Why do we use that?
Why? Because they can be internal. It's not just the external. It's going to be able to get an accurate temperature on the thickest part. You can calibrate it. And we use it for tests. Just to make sure things are in the date.
Biggest reason? I'm an old man and I can see it better than I can this. There's little guess about this particular thing, and it's quick and it's easy. So you can look at it and it registers one number instead of me interpreting the regular STEM thermometer down here, right? So there's less room for error, and we want to make sure that that temperature was within 1 or 2 degrees most of the time. How about this thermometer? Fork. It's attached to a fork, okay? Used for grilling of steaks and that type of stuff, and in a lot of restaurants we'll use that because it's a lot easier than trying to reach over something. So if you're doing a lot of grilling, that's a tool that we might be able to use to make sure that the internal temperature of one thing that's very important is hamburger. So they might use that. How about this thermometer up here on top? It's an oven thermometer. And if you look at these thermometers, they have 2 purposes. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. You know, the way to use these is you got this little thing up here on the front and you stick it down so that you can hold it, and you can actually put your finger on top of it to hold it down on the food. A lot of times we'll just take the thermometer and stick it down. Well, that's a purpose of this little thing, is to give you a little extension for your hand. Because guess what? Your hand is 98 degrees. So this is plastic. It doesn't conduct heat. So that's the purpose of your little holder, is to help you with that so you can dip into the food. Remembering to wipe it down with what? I just dip mine in tequila. Little bottle I carry with me all the time, right? Well, that's contamination. So what are you wiping it down? You can't use sanitizer. So what's the best thing to wipe down the thermometer with?
They actually have thermometer wipes that you can use, and they're prepackaged. You rip them open, use a little wet wipe, and use one for each time.
If you want to do it a cheap way, look at the ingredients on that particular wipe and use a clean cloth, and you'll see what the ingredients are. You have another type of thermometer, and that's the fact that we have a candy thermometer and another type of thermometer that's here, and that's the fact that this is a meat thermometer that goes down into big pieces of meat. Then you have 2 different types of thermometers here. One's a refrigerator and one's an oven. The square is an oven. The round is refrigeration that you put inside. So you can actually put it inside the oven. What's the two different ways to calibrate a thermometer if you don't have a little nut to turn?
Either an ice bath, stick it in ice water, and that's going to bring it down to make sure that it's reading at the 32 degrees.
So you have the ice bath method and specific instructions on how to do it. And you have the boiling point method. So you're looking at 32 degrees and 212. Now I can go into all kinds of complications about how high are we from sea level. That's going to throw off boiling point because water boils at a different temperature depending on what altitude you're at. But for all intent and purpose, it's 212 degrees in this area. So let's go back to one of the things that was in this film. Washing dishes. Where was the temperature taken?
The surface of the plate.
Surface of the plate. How do we test that?
I test it with a sticker that I get from Ecolab that actually has a temperature on it. I run it through the machine and it turns black if it's at 160 or higher.
So a paper thermometer.
It's a sticker. It's a, yes.
It's a paper thermometer that gives you a color indication as to whether or not that temperature has been reached. There's a much cheaper way. And that cheaper way has to do what's called a holding thermometer. And that holding thermometer is nothing more than a piece of metal with a thermometer in it that when it gets to the highest point, it stops. That's why it's called a holding thermometer. So I use this and I put it inside a dish tray, that's why it's got this little hoop on it, and let it run through the entire cycle. And it'll give me the hottest temperature that the cycle runs. Sanitation, wash, and everything else. Now the reason I do that is because there's two different types of dish machines that we have, and what are they? They're temperature sanitized and there's chemical sanitized. If it's chemical sanitized, I can't go above a certain temperature or else the chemical is rendered ineffective. And if it is hot water sanitized, I have to have a certain temperature for a certain length of time. Okay? So that's why I use this instead of the paper thermometers, but the paper thermometer can be purchased for 180, 160, 165, 140, 155, or whatever. There's one machine that I know of that is chemical sanitized, and that's the one out at George's Kitchen. It is a chlorine machine. No hot water at that kitchen. Chlorine machine. We got written up for it, that we weren't properly sanitizing dishes. Why? The manager didn't know. Not once, but we got written up and written up and written up and written up, and I walked in and I said, of course we're not going to reach that temperature. It's a chemically sanitized machine. It says so right on the machine. Auto-chlor. Now the health department says what about chlorine? Dilution, when we're talking about dilution. Is it okay, where was it? I walked into a kitchen yesterday, or last week, and we have an employee that'll go nameless that's sitting there with a gallon jug, and that gallon jug is being used to dispense chemical. And I said, boy, that's real use dilution. After he poured half a gallon into a mop bucket, you wonder what that concentration is going to be. It's a waste of chemical. But more importantly, that chemical, because it's too much, might be ineffective, and we also might chemically contaminate because we've made it too strong. So as the film strip identified, it's use dilution. And specifically in Texas, it's a violation, non-critical, if chemical is too much in a dish machine or too much in a dish wash area. Why? Not because it won't sanitize, but it's against manufacturer's recommendations. So you'll get a non-critical violation of 3 for that particular violation. Okay? Lots of details. Flies I'm asked about. If you see 1 fly in my operation, are you going to write up? No, I'm going to look for 4. And the reason I'm going to look for 4 is because that's what Texas tells me to do. Not 1. It tells me to look for 4 flies or fruit flies in the area of produce. And if so, I have to write you up for that. What's it say about cockroaches? What's it say about mice? What's the number? 1. Okay? So 1 fly flying around the kitchen is not a violation, but 4 flies observed are. So there's specific regulations that tell a health inspector especially what they're supposed to do and when they're supposed to write it up. I have access to those. So if you have a question, and you know, health inspectors aren't always right. And we as operators have the ability to challenge that health department's observation. But we have to know what the observation was. If the manager's not there and we can't speak to what was seen, we can't challenge. Because that bad score can mean a lot. Has anyone in here ever had an employee with hepatitis A? Do you know what happens? You talked about it in the film strip. What's the first thing you have to do? George, what?
That particular employee has to be taken off the line or wherever they're at, sent to the medical facility.
They can't work, right? They can't work until they're cleared. Normally it takes a period of 6 to 12 weeks, something like that. But more importantly, what else happens?
Your operation should be shut down and cleaned.
Tracy had the answer. It's immediately reported to health authorities. Once it's reported to the health authorities, what happens? It becomes public knowledge. And that employee, I will tell you because I had an employee who showed up to work with hepatitis A. The health department visits that employee's home to look at the living conditions of where that might have come from, but they also visit the place of work. And they ask a question. And that's the fact of who have you been in contact with for the last so often, and they do personal interviews of every one of those people, and every one of you would be getting a hepatitis A test because you had association with that particular employee. And on your kitchen, it's sort of like quarantine. This kitchen has been exposed to hepatitis A. And every one of the customers is notified. And guess what happens at that point? Here's channel 4, channel 5, channel 53, English, Spanish, you name the language, they're reporting on your particular kitchen. And it's happened here in Fort Worth a couple of times. Just remember that every one of our health scores are public knowledge. You can go and find out what your last health score was by going to the health department. So as the film pointed out, we can do everything we can. We can buy the resources. We can make sure that we instruct you. We can make sure that the equipment is bought, that equipment is repaired, equipment is maintained. But when it comes down to it, the most important thing about food service is you.